The winter of 1885 draped the Bitterroot Valley in a quilt of snow, and as the sun sank low, the Montana sky blazed with hues of crimson and gold, like a painter's final stroke before nightfall. In the quiet settlement of Elk Creek, where lamplight flickered from the saloon and the distant clink of a piano wove through the icy air, Abigail Harper stood on the porch of her boarding house, her breath clouding in the February chill. At 61, her silver hair framed a face etched with stories of love won, loss endured, and the stubborn will that kept her standing. She'd run this place alone for 10 years, ever since her husband, Samuel, was taken by a fever that swept through the wagon trains. Tonight, though, the wind carried an unease, as if the valley itself was whispering of changes to come. Abigail was about to turn the key in the heavy oak door when a shadow caught her eye. A lone figure emerged from the dusk, trudging down the snow-dusted street, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. He was tall, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a weathered coat, a leather satchel slung across his chest. A gray-flecked beard framed his face, and his eyes, though tired, held a quiet intensity that made her pause. He stopped at the foot of her porch, tipped his hat, and said, "Evening, ma'am. I'm looking for a room. Name's Elias Thornton." His voice was deep, warm, like the crackle of a fire, but there was a weight in it, a hint of roads traveled. Too long? Abigail's hand tightened on the key. Elk Creek wasn't a place strangers wandered into, not in the heart of winter when the trails were buried under snow. "We're full," she said, her tone firmer than she felt. It wasn't true. There was a room upstairs, untouched for months, its silence a reminder of quieter days. "Try the saloon down the way." Elias didn't move. He reached into his satchel, his movements deliberate, and drew out a small, tarnished locket, its silver chain catching the faint glow of her lantern. "This belonged to my wife," he said, his voice softer now. "She passed in '78 back in Virginia. I've been looking for a place to rest since then. No trouble, ma'am. Just a man needing a roof and a fire." Her heart stirred, though she fought it. Abigail had heard too many tales from drifters men with smooth words and empty promises, but Elias's quiet sincerity, the way he held the locket like it anchored him to a life long gone, chipped at her resolve. She studied his face, searching for deceit, but found only a man worn by time and loss, yet still standing. "One night," she said at last, turning the key with a soft click, "you'll pay up front, and I don't abide trouble." A faint smile tugged at his lips, softening the lines around his eyes. "Fair enough, Mrs. Harper." She led him inside, where the boarding house welcomed them with the scent of cedar and the lingering warmth of cornbread baked for her few boarders. The parlor's hearth glowed softly, casting shadows across the polished floorboards. Abigail guided Elias up the narrow staircase to a room at the end of the hall, its window framed by frost and overlooking the dark silhouettes of pines. She lit the oil lamp, its golden light spilling over the quilted bed and a small pine table. Elias set his satchel down carefully, his fingers brushing a folded letter tucked inside, its edges worn as if it had been read 100 times. "You've built something fine here," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Reminds me of home, long ago." Abigail raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "And where's home, Mr. Thornton?" He turned to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. "Virginia, once. A farm with apple trees and a porch that creaked in the summer. Now, I suppose home's wherever I lay my head." His words hung in the air, heavy with a longing that tugged at her. She knew that ache, the ghost of a life left behind, but she didn't press him. Some stories, she'd learned, only came when the teller was ready. As she moved to leave, Elias's voice stopped her at the door. "Mrs. Harper, you ever feel like the past ain't quite let you go?" She froze, her hand resting on the frame. The question was a spark, igniting memories of Samuel's laughter, the way he'd hum hymns while mending harnesses, the promises they'd made under a starlit sky. "More often than I care to admit," she said softly, her voice betraying a vulnerability she hadn't meant to share. She turned to meet his gaze, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, strangers bound by an unspoken understanding. "Good night, Mr. Thornton." She descended the stairs, the wind rattling the windows like a restless spirit. Abigail poured herself a cup of tea, her hands steady but her mind anything but. Elias Thornton was just a boarder, a man passing through. Yet something about him, the locket, his quiet question, the shadow in his eyes stirred her heart, long quiet like a melody she thought she'd forgotten. What secrets did this stranger carry, and why did they feel so entwined with her own? The morning after Elias Thornton's arrival, Elk Creek woke to a brittle dawn, the snow sparkling under a pale Montana sun. Abigail Harper stood in the kitchen of her boarding house, kneading dough for biscuits, her hands moving with the practiced rhythm of years. The scent of brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint crackle of the hearth. Yet her thoughts weren't on the tasks at hand. They kept drifting to the stranger upstairs, Elias, with his weathered face and the locket he'd held. Like a lifeline. His question from last night about the past not letting go had lingered like a melody she couldn't shake. She pushed the dough harder, as if to knead away the unease. The creak of the staircase broke her reverie. Elias appeared in the doorway, his coat brushed clean of snow, his satchel slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I'll settle up for the room and be on my way." Abigail glanced at him, noting the faint shadows under his eyes as if sleep had eluded him. "No need to rush," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "Breakfast's nearly ready. Sit, unless you're in a hurry to freeze out there." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he nodded and took a seat at the oak table. Setting his satchel beside him, she served him a plate of biscuits, bacon, and a mug of black coffee, her movements brisk but not unkind. The other boarders, a retired prospector and a young schoolteacher, were already out, leaving the kitchen quiet save for the soft clink of cutlery. Elias ate slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the pines stood sentinel against the snow. "You've got a knack for this," he said, gesturing to the plate. "Reminds me of my mother's cooking back in Virginia. She'd make biscuits so light they'd near float off the table." Abigail allowed a small smile. "High praise, Mr. Thornton, but flattery won't lower your bill." He chuckled, a low, genuine sound that warmed the room more than the fire. "Fair enough, I'm no freeloader." He reached for his pocket but paused, his fingers brushing the satchel. "Mind if I ask something?" Abigail leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Depends on the question." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "This place, it's yours, through and through. What keeps you here, running it alone?" The question caught her off guard, stirring memories of Samuel's dreams for this house, their plans to fill it with laughter and guests. "It's home," she said simply, her voice tighter than she meant. "And someone's got to keep the lamps lit." Elias nodded, as if her answer carried more weight than she'd intended. He sipped his coffee, then said, "I passed through Elk Creek once, years ago, on my way west. Never thought I'd find myself back here." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "What brought you this time?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "A promise," he said at last. "One I made a long time ago, to someone who's gone now. I'm not sure I can keep it, but I owe it to her to try." His voice held a quiet resolve, but beneath it, Abigail sensed a grief that mirrored her own. She busied herself with clearing his plate, avoiding his gaze. "Promises can be heavy things," she said, her tone softer now. "Especially the ones we make to those we've lost." Elias looked up, his expression unreadable. "You sound like you know a thing or two about that." She didn't answer, but the silence between them felt like a bridge, tentative but real. As she turned to the sink, she noticed his satchel, its flap slightly open, revealing the corner of that folded letter. A wax seal gleamed faintly, bearing a crest she couldn't quite make out. Before she could ask, Elias stood, pulling a few coins from his pocket. "For the room and the meal," he said. "I'll be out by noon." But Abigail, acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, shook her head. "Storm's brewing out there," she said, glancing at the window where clouds were gathering. "You won't make it far before it hits? Stay another night? The room's yours if you want it." He studied her as if weighing her words against some inner scale. "You don't strike me as the type to take in strays," he said, a hint of a smile returning. "Maybe I'm not," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But I've learned to trust my instincts, and they're telling me you're not just passing through." The words surprised her, bold and unguarded, but she didn't take them back. Elias's smile faded, replaced by something deeper, gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. "I'll stay," he said quietly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper." As he returned. Upstairs, Abigail stood by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly. She'd meant to keep her distance, to treat Elias like any other boarder. But his presence, his story, had stirred something in her, a curiosity, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She glanced at the staircase, where the echo of his footsteps lingered. What promise drove this man across a frozen land, and why did it feel like her own past was calling her to find out? By midday, the snow in Elk Creek had begun to soften under a hesitant sun, turning the streets into a patchwork of slush and mud. Inside Abigail Harper's boarding house, the air was warm with the scent of pine logs burning in the hearth and a pot of venison stew simmering on the stove. Abigail stood at the parlor window, her hand smoothing her apron, watching as Elias Thornton stepped out to the woodpile, his axe glinting as he split logs with steady, practiced swings. His presence, now in its second day, felt both foreign and familiar, like a song she'd heard long ago but couldn't quite place. She shook her head, scolding herself for such thoughts. At 61, she had no business letting a stranger stir her heart, yet his quiet strength and shadowed eyes kept pulling her gaze. Elias returned, his arms laden with firewood, his breath clouding in the crisp air. He stomped the snow from his boots at the door and carried the logs to the hearth, stacking them neatly. "You didn't have to do that," Abigail said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the kitchen doorway. "Boarders pay for a bed, not chores?" Elias dusted his hands, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Habit, I suppose. My father always said idle hands make for a restless mind." He glanced at her, his eyes catching the firelight. "Besides, it's the least I can do for your hospitality." She nodded, unsure whether to feel grateful or unsettled by his ease in her home. To break the moment, she gestured to the table. "Stew's ready if you're hungry. No sense letting it go cold." Elias took a seat, and Abigail served him a bowl, the rich aroma filling the room. As she sat across from him, her own bowl untouched, she noticed the way his hands calloused but careful held the spoon, as if every movement was deliberate. "You're not like most who pass through here," she said, her voice measured. "Drifters usually talk too much or not at all. You're somewhere in between?" He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Mrs. Harper," he paused, his spoon resting against the bowl. "Truth is, I've had years to learn when to speak and when to listen. The trail teaches you that, if nothing else." Abigail tilted her head, curious despite herself. "You've been on the move a long time, then?" Elias's gaze drifted to the window, where the pines swayed gently. "Since '78, he said. "After my wife, Clara, passed, I sold the farm in Virginia and started west. Thought I'd find something, peace maybe, or a reason to stop running." The mention of his wife, Clara, sent a pang through Abigail. She knew that kind of lost the hollow ache that lingered like a guest. "Who wouldn't leave?" "I'm sorry," she said softly, "losing someone like that. It changes you." Elias met her eyes, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to vanish. "It does, but it also makes you hold tighter to what matters." "That's why. I'm here, I reckon, to keep a promise I made to her." Abigail's fingers tightened around her spoon. "The one you mentioned yesterday?" He nodded, his expression guarded but not closed. "Clara loved stories, tales of the frontier, of people building lives from nothing. She made me promise to see the West, to find a place worth calling home again. I've been looking ever since. But Elk Creek..." He trailed off, his gaze settling on the hearth. "There's something about this valley. Feels like it's asking me to stay." Abigail's heart quickened, though she kept her face composed. His words echoed her own thoughts, the ones she'd buried since Samuel's death. "Valleys don't talk, Mr. Thornton," she said, her tone lighter than she felt. "But I'll grant you, this one's got a way of holding folks. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. When Elias finished, he leaned back, his hands resting on the table. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Harper?" She braced herself, sensing the weight behind his words. "Go on," he hesitated, then said, "You've built this place, kept it running alone. But do you ever think about what comes next? What you want, not just what you're holding together." The question struck deeper than she expected, stirring memories of dreams she and Samuel had shared, a garden blooming with roses, a porch. Swing for quiet evenings, a life filled with more than just survival. She stood, gathering their bowls to hide the flush in her cheeks. "I don't think much about wants," she said, her voice steady but quieter. "Needs keep me busy enough." Elias watched her, his eyes gentle but piercing. "Maybe, but I've seen folks forget how to want anything at all, and it's a lonely road." The truth in his words stung, and Abigail turned to the sink, her hands gripping the edge. She wanted to argue, to say she was content, but the lie wouldn't come down. As she washed the dishes, Elias rose and reached for his satchel, pulling out the folded letter she'd glimpsed before. He held it for a moment, as if debating, then set it on the table. "This came from me in Bozeman before I headed here," he said. "It's from Clara's sister, back east. Says she found something Clara left behind, a journal, maybe, or letters. I'm not sure I'm ready to read it, but it's why I'm passing through." Abigail dried her hands, her eyes on the letter's wax seal, which bore a faint crest of a tree. "Why not read it?" she asked, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Elias's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "Because some truths hurt more than the not knowing." He paused, then added, "But I'll face it, soon enough. Just need a little time." Abigail nodded, respecting his silence. She glanced at the window, where the sky had darkened with the promised storm. "You've got time," she said. "Storm's here. You're not going anywhere today." He smiled. A mix of gratitude and something unspoken. "Seems Elk Creek's got plans for me yet." As he headed upstairs to his room, Abigail lingered by the table, her fingers brushing the letter he'd left behind. She didn't touch it. Some boundaries weren't hers to cross, but its presence felt like a whisper from the past, pulling her toward a story she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. What was it about Elias's promise that felt like a key to her own locked heart? And what would happen when he finally opened that letter? The storm that swept through Elk Creek that afternoon in February 1885 was relentless, blanketing the Bitterroot Valley in a swirl of snow that turned the world beyond the boarding house windows into a white haze. Inside, the hearth glowed warmly, its light dancing across the parlor where Abigail Harper sat mending a quilt, her needle moving with the steady rhythm of habit. Across the room, Elias Thornton cleaned his boots by the fire, the scent of leather polish mingling with the faint pine smoke. The quiet between them was comfortable now, less like the silence of strangers and more like that of two souls finding their footing. Abigail stole a glance at him, noting the way his hands worked with care, as if even small tasks carried meaning. Elias caught her gaze and offered a small smile. "You're handy with that needle, Mrs. Harper," he said, nodding toward the quilt. "My Clara used to sew like that, every stitch precise as a map." Abigail's hands paused, the mention of Clara stirring a mix of curiosity and something softer like recognition. "My Samuel taught me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with warmth. "He'd sit with me evenings, mending harnesses, while I worked on quilts. Said it was the only way to keep me from talking his ear off." Elias chuckled, a low sound that filled the room like a melody. "Sounds like a man who knew how to keep peace." She smiled, a rare softness breaking through her usual reserve. "He was, but he loved a good story too. Used to say the West was built on them tales of courage, love, and promises kept." Her words hung in the air, and Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's what Clara believed," he said. "She'd read dime novels about cowboys and homesteaders, always dreaming of a place like this. I think she'd have liked you, Mrs. Harper." The sincerity in his voice caught Abigail off guard, and she felt a flush rise to her cheeks, one she hadn't felt in years. To shift the moment, she set the quilt aside and stood. "If you're stuck here another day, you might as well make "Yourself useful," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. "The shed out back needs organizing tools are a mess, and I haven't had time to sort them." Elias rose, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Lead the way," he said, his eyes glinting with a spark of amusement. They bundled into coats and scarves, stepping out into the storm's edge, where the wind stung but the worst of the snow had eased. The shed was a small, weathered structure behind the boarding house, its shelves cluttered with rusted tools, coils of rope, and jars of nails. Abigail handed Elias a lantern, its light casting long shadows as they worked side by side, sorting hammers from chisels, stacking wood scraps, and sweeping out the dust of seasons past. Their movements fell into an easy rhythm, as if they'd done this 100 times. When their hands brushed while reaching for the same tin of screws, neither pulled away immediately, and Abigail felt a warmth that had little to do with the lantern's glow. "You've got a knack for this, too," she said, nodding at the now orderly shelves. Elias shrugged, but his smile was genuine. "Grew up on a farm. You learn to fix what's broken or make do." He paused, holding a worn hammer, its handle smooth from use. "This was someone's pride once," he said almost to himself. "You can tell by the way it's worn." Abigail watched him, struck by the reverence in his voice. "You see stories in everything, don't you?" she asked. He met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Always have. Clara used to say I could find a tail in a bent nail or a cracked fence post." He set the hammer down, his expression softening. "What's your story, Mrs. Harper? Not the boarding house, not the work. What's the part you don't tell folks?" The question was gentle but direct, and Abigail felt her guard waver. She turned to a shelf, rearranging jars to buy time. "Not much to tell," she said at last. "Came west with Samuel in '65. Built this place together, dreamed of filling it with life. When he died, I kept it going. That's the story." Elias stepped closer, his presence steadying. "That's the work," he said quietly. "But what about the dreams?" Abigail's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken of dreams in years, not since Samuel's voice faded from her nights. "Dreams don't keep the fire lit," she said, but her voice betrayed a tremor. Elias didn't push, but his silence invited her to continue. "I used to want a garden," she admitted, almost whispering. "Roses like my mother had back in Ohio, a place to sit and watch the sunset, not just work through it." He nodded as if her words were a map he could follow. "You could still have that," he said. "Roses grow even in hard soil if you give them a chance." Abigail looked at him, her heart stirring with a hope she'd thought long buried. Before she could respond, a gust of wind rattled the shed door, and Elias moved to secure it, his shoulder brushing hers. The moment lingered, unspoken but heavy with possibility. As they finished, Abigail noticed the letter from Clara's sister still tucked in Elias's satchel, its wax seal catching the lantern's light. "You still haven't read it?" she said, not quite a question. Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Not yet," he said. "It's complicated. Clara's sister thinks there's something in those pages I need to know, but I'm not sure I'm ready for it." Abigail nodded, understanding the weight of words left unread. "Take your time," she said. "But secrets don't get lighter with waiting." They walked back to the house, the snow crunching under their boots, the sky now a deep indigo. Inside, Abigail stoked the fire, and Elias hung his coat by the door. "I'll stay another day," he said, his voice low but certain. "If that's all right." Abigail met his gaze, her heart beating faster than it had in years. "It's all right," she said, and the words felt like a promise she hadn't meant to make. As Elias headed upstairs, Abigail stood by the hearth, her fingers tracing the edge of the quilt she'd been mending. His presence was weaving itself into her days, pulling at threads she'd thought were long cut. What was it about this man that made her want to dream again, and what truth in that letter might change everything? The snowstorm that had held Elk Creek in its grip began to wane by the third morning of Elias Thornton's stay, leaving the Bitterroot Valley cloaked in a quiet, glistening white. Inside Abigail Harper's boarding house, the morning light streamed through the parlor windows, casting a soft glow over the oak table where Abigail set out a breakfast of fresh-baked cornbread, honey, and steaming coffee. The scent of warmth and comfort filled the air, but her thoughts were restless, tangled in the growing presence of Elias, his quiet companionship, his stories of Clara, and the unspoken promise in his letter had woven themselves into her days, stirring a hope she'd long thought buried. At 61, Abigail wasn't sure she trusted that hope, but she couldn't deny its pull. Elias descended the stairs, his coat draped over his arm, his satchel in hand. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth that had first caught her off guard. "Smells like heaven in here." Abigail gestured to the table, her expression composed but her heart quickening. "Sit before it." "Gets cold," she said. "Storm's easing, but the trails are still a mess. No sense rushing out yet." Elias hesitated, then set his satchel by the door and took a seat, his eyes meeting hers with a gratitude that needed no words. They ate in a comfortable silence at first, the clink of spoons against mugs the only sound. Then Elias spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You ever miss the East, Mrs. Harper?" "Ohio, you said?" Abigail paused, her spoon hovering over her plate. "Sometimes," she admitted. "The green of spring there, it's different, softer, but the West, it's where I became myself. Samuel and I built something here, even if it wasn't all we planned." Elias nodded, spreading honey on his cornbread. "Clara was the same. Born in Virginia, but her heart was out here, in the stories she read. She'd have loved this valley, the way it holds you close." Abigail smiled, a flicker of connection, warming her. "Sounds like we'd have gotten along, your Clara and me. She had good taste in dreams." Elias's eyes softened and he leaned back, his hands resting on the table. "She did. And she'd have said you're living one, keeping this place alive. It's no small thing, what you've done." The compliment landed gently, but it stirred a question Abigail had been avoiding. "And you, Elias? What's your dream, now that you're here?" He looked down, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "For a long time I didn't have one," he said. "Just kept moving, chasing Clara's promise. But these past few days..." He met her gaze, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. "I'm starting to think maybe I've found a place worth staying for." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Abigail's breath caught as she busied herself with refilling his coffee, her hands steadier than her heart. "Elk Creek's got a way of doing that," she said. Her tone light, but her eyes betraying her after breakfast. Elias offered to help with the day's chores, and Abigail, sensing a need to keep moving, agreed. They stepped outside to clear snow from the boarding house's front path, their shovels scraping against the frozen ground. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue, and the valley stretched before them, serene and untouched. As they worked, Elias spoke of his travels crossing the Rockies, sleeping under stars in Wyoming, meeting homesteaders with dreams as big as the land. Abigail listened, captivated by the cadence of his voice, the way he painted pictures with words. "You're a storyteller too," she said, pausing to catch her breath. "Samuel would have liked you?" Elias smiled, leaning on his shovel. "I'd have liked him, from what you've said. A man who loved stories and built a home like this, he must have been something." Abigail nodded, her throat tight. "He was, but life doesn't stop when someone's gone. I learned that the hard way." Elias's expression grew serious. "You're stronger than most, Abigail. Not everyone keeps going like you have." The use of her first name, unprompted, sent a shiver through her. Not of cold, but of something alive and new. They finished the path and returned inside, their cheeks flushed from the chill. In the parlor, Elias reached for his satchel, pulling out the letter from Clara's sister. He held it, his fingers tracing the wax seal with its tree crest. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he said, his voice low. "Part of me wants to burn it, let the past stay buried. But another part, it's like Clara's still speaking through it." Abigail sat across from him, her hands clasped. "What's stopping you?" she asked gently. Elias looked at her, his eyes raw with vulnerability. "Fear, I reckon. What if it changes everything I thought I knew about her? About us?" Abigail reached out, her hand resting near his but not touching. "Sometimes the truth hurts, Elias, but it's better than living with ghosts. Samuel taught me that." I didn't read his last letter to me for a year after he died. When I did, it broke me, but it also set me free." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "You're right," he said. "I'll read it tonight, but I'd like you there, if you're willing." The request surprised her, but it felt right, like a step neither could take alone. "I'll be here," she said, her voice a promise. As he tucked the letter away, their hands brushed, and this time neither pulled back. The moment was brief but electric, a spark that lit something new in Abigail's heart. As evening approached, Abigail lit the parlor lamps, her mind racing. Elias's presence had become a part of her world, his stories and silences filling spaces she hadn't known were empty. But the letter loomed like a shadow, its secrets waiting to unfold. What truth would Elias find in those pages, and how would it bind or break the fragile bond growing between them? By the evening of Elias Thornton's 4th day in Elk Creek, the Bitterroot Valley lay serene under a starlit sky, the storm's last whispers fading into a gentle breeze. Inside Abigail Harper's boarding house, the parlor glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, their flicker casting shadows across the walls where Abigail and Elias sat by the hearth. The letter from Clara's sister rested on the table between them, its wax seal unbroken but heavy with promise. Abigail's hands were clasped in her lap, her heart a mix of anticipation and quiet resolve. Elias's presence had become a steady rhythm in her days, and tonight, as they prepared to face the truth in that letter, she felt a connection deeper than she dared admit. Elias picked up the letter, his fingers steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "I've put this off too long," he said, his voice low, like the wind outside. Clara's sister said it's a journal she found, something Clara wrote before she passed. "I don't know what it holds, but I owe it to her to find out." Abigail nodded, her gaze gentle but unwavering. "You're not alone in this, Elias," she said. "Whatever's in there, we'll face it together." Her words, simple but certain, seemed to anchor him, and he broke the seal with a careful hand, unfolding the pages within. The journal was small, its leather cover worn but cherished, filled with Clara's neat, sloping handwriting. Elias read aloud, his voice catching at first but growing steadier. Clara wrote of her love for the West, her dreams of a home where mountains kissed the sky, and her hope that Elias would find peace after she was gone. "Keep my stories alive," she'd written, "and let your heart find a new one." As he read, Abigail saw tears glisten in his eyes, but he didn't stop. The final entry was a letter to him, urging him to forgive himself for the years they'd lost to her illness and to build a life where love could grow again. Elias closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. "She knew I'd keep running," he said, his voice thick. "She wanted me to stop, to find a home." Abigail reached out, her hand resting on his. "You found it, Elias," she said softly. "Elk Creek's been waiting for you." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time, the shadow of grief seemed lighter, softened by something new, hope, perhaps, or love. The days that followed were a quiet turning point. Spring crept into the valley, melting snow into streams that sparkled under the Montana sun. Elias stayed on, no longer a boarder, but a partner in the rhythm of Abigail's life. They planted a garden behind the boarding house, digging rows for roses and vegetables, their hands brushing in the soil. Elias shared stories of his travels, and Abigail told him of Samuel's dreams, their laughter mingling with the chirp of sparrows. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, Elias took her hand. "Abigail," he said, his voice steady, "I never thought I'd find a place to belong again, but you've given me that. Will you let me stay, not just as a friend, but as something more?" Abigail's heart swelled, the weight of years falling. "Away, I've been alone a long time, Elias," she said, her voice soft but sure. "But with you, I'm starting to remember what it feels like to live, not just survive. Yes, I want you to stay." He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that mirrored the sunset, and they sat in silence, their hands entwined. The valley stretching before them like a promise kept. Months passed, and the garden bloomed with roses, their petals vibrant against the green. The boarding house thrived, filled with new guests drawn by tales of Abigail and Elias's warmth. They built a swing on the porch, just as Abigail had dreamed, and evenings found them there, sharing stories of the West, some from Clara's journal, others from their own making. Their love, born of chance and nurtured by courage, became a quiet legend in Elk Creek, a testament to the power of second chances. As summer faded, Abigail and Elias stood in the garden, the roses now in full bloom. Clara would have loved this, Elias said, his voice filled with peace. Abigail nodded, her hand in his. And Samuel would have said, we're writing a new story, one worth telling. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they knew they'd built more than a home, they'd built a life. The story, rooted in the history of the American West, reminds us that love and resilience can bloom in the hardest of soils, just as homesteaders built lives from the wild. If this tale of second chances warmed your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to hear more stories of the frontier, where hope always finds a way.